Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Math with Mr. W. And our topic today is multiplying decimals. And over here we have the word zero. And first, before we even take off into the idea of multiplying two decimal numbers together, I want you to ask your students, is 2/10 greater than or less than 189 thousandths? Ask them that question. See if they're ready to understand what's taking place. Because if they say that 2/10 is less than this, because 2 is out smaller than 189, then they have missed the boat on the whole idea of decimals. Because we know that this is 2/10, but it's also 20 hundredths, and it's also 200 thousandths, which is bigger than 189 thousandths. So it's a question that you may be asking them not only this day, but ask them over and over again till they finally get the idea of how important that zero is, as it holds a place in here, even though it's not written. So with that, let's begin our multiplication. So I've written up 4 different multiplications. And here's where power of y has to be gotten. You have to bring this into the fold. So we'll start with this one. 3 2/10, the correct way to read it, 3 2/10 times 4/10. So we have 3 2/10 times 4/10, and we put down our 8. 4 times 3 is 12. You'll probably say to your students, I have 2 numbers behind the decimal. So from my right, I'll count back 1, 2, and I put my decimal here. And most of your class will say, great, and go right on. But how many of them will understand why? Will have any understanding of why you did that? And that's what you have to bring home. This is not unimportant. This is really valuable because you've already taught them how a fraction makes a decimal. Now you have to get them to understand that that thing that you just did still works. So you take a look and you say, well, 3 2/10. Well, 3 2/10 times 4/10. Now they know how to multiply fractions. Make them do the problem. They'll change this to 32/10 times 4/10, and that'll give them 128 hundredths. 128 hundredths. So they see that the answer has to be in hundredths. It's 128 hundredths. And they might have said, wait a minute, it's not 128, it's one. Oh, wait a minute. 128. Well, if I take 100 and I divide it into 128, it'll go in there one time, won't it? And there'll be 28 of those hundredths left over. So we have 1 and 28 hundredths. 128 hundredths. So by looking at the fraction, and having them remember that tenths times tenths make hundredths, and that's the reason why you have it, reminds them that the value of changing a fraction to a decimal, and they've also been back to changing a decimal into a fraction. So by doing both of these, the power of Y have really sent home something that's going to stay with them, something that they're not going to lose. Okay, so do this. And now let's do the same kind of a problem, but what I've done is I said 3 2/100 times 4/10. So here I have an 8. 4 times 2 is 8. We have a 0 and a 12. This time my decimal has got 3 over. It goes 3 times. But why? And don't be afraid to ask them to do this. Write this as a fraction. This is 3 2/100. And that's going to be multiplied by 4/10. So when I multiply tenths times hundredths, I'm going to get thousands. Tenths times hundreds gives me thousands. And that's why I have the 3 numbers past the decimal. Again, it's just solidifying in their minds how that happened. Okay, now I've changed it again. I've got 32 thousandths and 4/10. So how do I do this? Well, it's still the same idea. I have an 8 and a 12. But this time, I have 4 numbers behind the decimal. But I've only got 3 digits here. What am I going to do? Well, you're going to tell them 1, 2, 3. I have to add a 0 as a placeholder and do this. But they're going to say, some are going to say, why? But if you've done these two, then when you do 32 thousandths, that's what that is, 32 thousandths times 4/10. What does that give me? It gives me 128 10,000ths. And that's what it is, tenths, hundreds, thousandths, 10,000ths. So you remind them about how that becomes 10,000. And that's really what is neat. That's really what's neat. And so they believe you. They believe you. And that's a lot, the belief. We've talked about this before, that math is something that not only has to work, it has to be a process they have to really get, but they have to believe that it works. So, and finally over here, we have 30 2/10 times 4/100. And so again, we have the same numbers. 4 times 2 is 8. 4 times 0 is 0. And 4 times 3 is 12. And again, you tell them 3 places, so I get 1 208 thousandths. But again, show them how the decimals turned into fractions, because this is 30 2/10 times 4/100. The tenths times hundredths gives you thousandths. And that's why your decimal goes where it does in the answer. So remind them about the 0, how important that 0 is. Remind them, even if it's not there, you don't see it, it's still there. Don't let them forget that. And when you're doing this, remember to have them read the numbers correctly. And incorrectly is reading it as 3.02. No, it's 3 2/100 times 4/10. So make sure they read the problem correctly. And if they read it correctly, they'll have a much better understanding of what the solution is going to be. Thanks for being here. Thanks for seeing what I've done. And I hope that you might use this, and I hope it helps your students. See you next time on Math with Mr. W.